Jacques Lacan's concept of the letter stands as one of the most distinctive and theoretically dense contributions to 20th century psychoanalytic thought. Emerging from Lacan's sustained return to Freud. During the 1950s, the letter crystallizes his radical thesis that the unconscious is structured like a language, far from being a mere rhetorical flourish or a passing theoretical fancy. The letter constitutes the very material substrate through which the symbolic order operates. The unconscious thinks, and the subject is constituted.
The letter, in Lacan's hands, is not simply an alphabetic character or a written communication. It is the material medium. That concrete discourse borrows from language, the essentially localized structure of the signifier and the indivisible kernel around which the entire edifice of subjectivity is organized.
The present study undertakes an exhaustive examination of Lacan's concept of the letter as it appears across his major texts, most prominently in the instance of the letter in the unconscious, or reason since Freud. From 1957, and the Seminar on the Purloined Letter from 1956, while also trailing its reverberations throughout Lacan's later seminars and the extensive secondary literature.
Our aim is not merely to catalog isolated quotations, but to reconstruct a coherent theoretical account of what the letter means within Lacan's system. How does it differ from the signifier? How does it relate to the three registers of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real? And how does it function in the unconscious?
Speak to me. Why does Lacan insist, in one of his most famous words and controversial formulations, that a letter arrives at its destination? What destination is professionalism? Waits inside. You?
Understanding the letter is essential for grasping Lacan's entire theoretical edifice. It bridges his linguistic structuralism of the 1950s with his later topological and Borromean concerns. It explains how the unconscious can be both structured like a language and yet fundamentally resistant to meaning.
And it accounts for the peculiar materialism of Lacanian thought, in which language is not merely a tool for communication, but the very stuff of psychic reality.
Listen. The letter is the name Lacan gives to the opacity at the heart of language, the point where signification fails, and something more fundamental, something of the order of the real, insists.
In our introductory examination, we established that the letter stands as the material substrate through which the symbolic order operates. But how does this substrate actually define itself? How does it respond to the foundational thesis that the unconscious is structured like a language? Lacan's most explicit definition of the letter appears in his landmark 1957 essay, The Instance of the Letter in the Unconscious, or Reason since Freud, L'instance de la lettre dans l'inconscient, ou La raison depuis Freud, where he writes, By letter, I designate the material medium. That concrete discourse borrows from language.
This definition, while seemingly straightforward, opens onto a complex theoretical field. The letter is not the written character as such, nor is it the phoneme or the acoustic image. Rather, it occupies a curious intermediate space, what the translator and Lacanian scholar Bruce Fink describes as lying somewhere between the signifier and its microstructure, which is materialized or represented by type or printed characters without being equated with them. Somewhere between the signifier and the position within a word. That remains the same, despite the variability of the phoneme that occupies that place at any particular moment in time.
Think of it. The letter is the structural place that different sounds can occupy while maintaining the identity of a given signifier. Fink concludes, tellingly, that Lacan's definition of the letter continues to insist in its utter, unyielding opacity.
Lacan himself reinforces this definitional complexity. Later in the same essay, when he describes the letter as the essentially localized structure of the signifier. This phrase underscores two crucial properties of the letter. Its localization, meaning it occupies a specific, determinate place within a structure, and its structural function, meaning it is not a positive entity, but a positional element within a differential system.
The letter is, in this sense, the minimal unit of the signifying chain. It is the element that, by virtue of its material presence and its structural position, makes signification possible, while itself remaining passive, fundamentally meaningless.
In his later teaching, particularly around Seminar 18 and beyond, Lacan sharpens the distinction between letter and signifier in a significant way. He situates the letter as belonging to the dimension of the real, while the signifier belongs to the dimension of the symbolic.
This is a crucial clarification. The signifier operates within the symbolic order, participating in the differential network that produces meaning through metaphor and metonymy. The letter, by contrast, is the real aspect of language, the material residue that resists absorption into the play of signification.
Do you feel it? It is for this reason Lacan suggests that he titled his essay The Instance of the Letter, and not The Instance of the Signifier, a choice that signals his concern with something that precedes and exceeds the purely symbolic functioning of language. What is left over when meaning is gone.
Perhaps the most radical consequence of Lacan's theory of the letter, which we have already traced, from its introductory centrality to its primary definitions as a real residue, is its profound and irreversible decentering of the subject. The subject, for Lacan, is not the master of its own speech, but is instead the vast symbolic system of language that pre-exists and exceeds the individual life.
This clinical reality flows directly from the premise that the unconscious is structured like a language. If language is a pre-existing field, then the subject is born into a matrix of letters they did not write. Lacan writes, "The subject, if he appears to be the slave of language, is all the more so of a discourse in the universal movement, in which his place is already inscribed at birth, if only by virtue of his proper name."
Your name. It was written down before your tongue could move. You were positioned, inscribed. The letter, as the cold material support of this discourse, marks the exact point
at which you are constituted.
as a subject, divided between conscious thought and unconscious truth.
This division is the fracture between the ego's imaginary coherence and the symbolic chain's disruptive force. This view of subjectivity challenges Cartesian models at their very root. The "I think" of the traditional cogito is revealed as a mere illusion, an effect of a signifying chain that operates independently of any conscious volition.
Recall our definition from Seminar 18. The letter is the real aspect of language, the meaningless residue that resists the symbolic play of meaning. This opacity is precisely what prevents the subject from ever coinciding with itself. It is what Lacan will later formalize through the matheme of the barred subject, S with a bar, through it. A subject cut by the letter.
Who is talking? When you do not think? The subject is a product of the letter, not the proud author of language, but its fragile effect, a temporary position within a structure that the letter both makes possible and perpetually, mercilessly destabilizes.
To understand how these abstract definitions take on a concrete and dynamic life, we must turn to Lacan's 1956 seminar on Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Purloined Letter. This text responds directly to our primary definitions from Node 2, where we characterize the letter not as a message, but as a localized structural place, an empty, meaningless slot. The seminar's explicit aim is to illustrate repetition automatism, the compulsion to repeat, that Freud identified in his 1920 work, Beyond the Pleasure Principle.
For Lacan, repetition is not a psychological tendency. inherent in human nature, but a structural consequence of the signifying chain's operation. The letter, as it passes from hand to hand, throughout Poe's narrative, demonstrates how the signifier sustains itself only in a displacement, comparable to that found in electric news strips or in the rotating memories of our machines that think like men. The signifier must leave its place in order to return to it by a circular path. This displacement is not accidental or arbitrary. It is constitutive of the symbolic order itself.
Think back to Node 3, of how the letter decenters you. In the story, whoever possesses the letter has their subjectivity radically altered. It is not the subjects who control the letter's trajectory. It is the letter that dictates their actions, their gazes, their very positions. In the triadic structure, you are not traveling. It is the letter that travels you.
Lacan's famous and controversial conclusion: thus it is that what the purloined letter, nay, the letter in sufferance, means is that a letter always arrives at its destination, must be understood entirely. Within this structural context, the letter in sufferance, lettre en souffrance, is a precise postal term for a letter that has been delayed, left waiting, or misdirected.
Lacan seizes on this expression to emphasize that even the letter's deviation from its proper imaginary path is part of its structural destiny. The destination in question is not a conscious addressee or person, but a structural position within the symbolic network, a position that the letter inevitably occupies, regardless of the intentions of the subjects who handle it.
Do you see? The envelope arrives because the slot was already waiting. You cannot hide from it, even if it goes astray. Its detour is the only path that brings you to yourself. The letter finds its place.
One of the most persistent sources of confusion in reading Jacques Lacan is the precise relationship between the letter and the signifier, signifiant. While Lacan sometimes uses these terms interchangeably or in close proximity, his later teaching clarifies a crucial distinction that flows directly from our primary definitions in Node 2. We must state it clearly. The signifier belongs completely to the symbolic register, while the letter belongs to the dimension of the real.
Let us examine how this distinction operates. The signifier functions within the vast, differential network of language, producing meaning through its endless relations to other signifiers via metaphor, and through its constant displacement along the chain of signification via metonymy. The letter, by contrast, is the material support of this symbolic operation, the raw, unyielding stuff of language that actively resists absorption into the play of meaning.
This clear distinction helps to clarify Lacan's notorious reformulation of Ferdinand de Saussure's linguistic sign, where Saussure represented the sign as a harmonious unity of signifier and signified, with the horizontal bar between them representing their arbitrary connection. Lacan's radical algorithm, S over lowercase s, emphasizes the absolute primacy of the signifier and the fundamental impossibility of any final stable meaning. The horizontal bar represents the insurmountable resistance to signification.
The letter is precisely what occupies this bar. It is the material residue that prevents the signifier from ever fully coinciding with the signified. This relates directly to the drama we witnessed in Node 4. During the seminar on the purloined letter, in that circuit, the actual content of the paper, its symbolic meaning or signified message, was entirely irrelevant. It was the physical letter itself, in its raw, localized materiality, that occupied the bar, driving the subject's repetitive, symbolic behaviors, regardless of what was written inside.
Can you hear the silent slot inside the words you speak? Consider what a letter is in the structural sense. As commentators note, the letter is the structural place, occupied by phonemes. It is a place in a word, which can be occupied by a variety of sounds. And yet, the word remains exactly the same.
Bruce Fink offers a helpful orthographic example. The letters in the word through occupy the place of a single letter in the structural sense. This structural place can be filled by different phonemes without altering the word's identity. As a signifier, this letter is not affected if the word's spelling changes from through, so long as this change still allows us to discern the vocable through or through from other vocables, like throw or thorough.
The letter, on this account, is the structural coordinate that provides the signifier with its stability, allowing for the variability of its phonemic realization. It is a point of anchorage in the shifting sands of speech.
And yet, it is a paradox. The letter is both the very condition of meaning and the exact point where meaning fails. It is the hard edge where the raw real of language interrupts the symbolic scene. Endless floating play. Signification stops here. The letter simply is.
Lacan's dynamic concept of the letter receives striking confirmation in his clinical analysis of Sigmund Freud's famous case of the Wolfman, Sergei Pankajev. This case illustrates a fundamental Lacanian principle that the signifier persists as a letter without meaning, shaping the destiny of the subject, independently of conscious understanding. This clinical reality flows directly from our introduction in Node 1, where we established that the letter is the material substrate, where signification fails, and something of the order of the real insists.
Let us look at the structure of this case. In his detailed case history, Freud noted the recurrent, uncanny appearance of the meaningless letter V in multiple guises throughout the patient's life. It appeared in names, in numbers, in dates, and in somatic symptoms, without carrying any apparent semantic content.
Where a traditional, imaginative analyst might immediately see this V as a symbolic representation of something else, an open vagina, a virginity, or a butterfly's wings. Lacan reads it precisely as a letter. That is to say, he reads it as a signifier, without a signified. This returns us directly to the crucial distinction we made in Node 5. The signifier is symbolic, but the letter is the real.
The Wolfman's V is the paradigmatic example of the letter's insistence. The way a particular signifier, stripped of all meaning, can organize an entire life history through its repetitive return. The letter V does not mean anything. It simply is. Its empty, differential registration is what structures the subject's repetition automatism.
Listen to the shape of it. Two lines meeting at a single, sharp point. As Lacan emphasizes, to decipher this letter, yet its effects proceed and exceed any act of interpretation. The letter is already there, operating in the dark of your unconscious, before you ever try to understand it.
The Wolfman's V is not a hidden symbol, waiting to be interpreted, but a letter to be read. To be read in its literalness, its materiality, and its structural position.
Hence, the analyst's task is not to replace the letter with some comforting meaning, not to make the patient believe they have solved the riddle of their life. The task is to recognize the letter as a letter, to acknowledge its absolute opacity and its structural insistence.
Stop trying to translate yourself. What if your deepest symptom is just a letter written in the real? Stop translating and learn to read. What is written?
Jacques Derrida's extended philosophical critique of Lacan's Seminar, published in 1975, under the title The Purveyor of Truth, Le Facteur de la Vérité, represents the most significant challenge to Lacan's entire theory of the letter. To understand this debate, we must link it back to Node 3 and the radical decentering of the subject, as well as to Node 6, where we witnessed the unwavering insistence of the letter in the real.
Derrida's argument
is complex and multi-layered, but its central thrust can be summarized. Lacan's claim that a letter arrives at its destination is a logocentric and phallogocentric attempt to master the free play of signification.
Derrida argues that Lacan belongs into a framework that tries to arrest the endless displacement of the signifier and to guarantee the arrival of meaning at its proper place. For Derrida, the letter's very structure includes as an absolute necessity the possibility of not arriving. This inherent capacity for failure, for loss, and for dissemination is not accidental, but constitutive of the letter as such. He writes, not that the letter never arrives at its destination, but part of its structure is that it is always capable of not arriving there. Thus, Derrida accuses Lacan of totalizing the signifier, of reifying it into a phallic unity that must complete its circuit and return to its origin.
Always purloined. Always stolen. Displaced. Detoured. For Derrida, this displacement is not a temporary deviation from a proper preordained path. It is the very condition of language. There is no safe home for a word to return to. The letter is lost from the very start.
Derrida's elegant critique has been enormously influential,
and it highlights a genuine, unresolved tension
in Lacan's written text. However, as Barbara Johnson and other scholars have brilliantly argued,
Derrida may himself be guilty of the very totalization he attributes to Lacan.
He does this by forcing Lacan's ambiguous pronouncement into a definitive, simplistic statement that can then be easily critiqued.
Lacan's formula is compatible with a far more open-ended, less teleological interpretation. As Barbara Johnson writes, wherever letters, by chance, do arrive, becomes their destination. On this reading, Lacan is not asserting a preordained destiny or a divine purpose. He is asserting the structural inevitability of position.
Wherever it lands, it will produce effects. Wherever the stamp falls,
It will constitute a subject.
it will determine a symbolic position. The destination is not preordained by a master's plan. It is retroactively written by the simple fact of the letter's landing. It is the landing that makes the home.
Lacan's fundamental thesis
That the unconscious,
is the discourse of the other,
l'inconscient est le discours de l'autre,
is directly illuminated by our entire developmental trajectory of the letter.
if the unconscious is structured like a language,
And if the letter is the material support of this language, then the unconscious itself is fundamentally a matter of letters.
it is composed of raw,
Signifying elements that precede and exceed. The individual subject.
This clinical assertion responds directly to our formulations. In Node 6, the other, l'autre, is the locus of these letters. It is the symbolic order in which they circulate and the network of signifiers. That constitutes the unconscious. Just as we saw with the Wolfman's meaningless letter V, in Node 6, these non-semantic marks do not originate in the subject's private imagination. They are inherited from the historical storehouse of the other.
It is not yours. The alphabet of your desire was assembled before you were a whisper. The letters write you because they belong to the other. What you think is your private secret is just a line copied. Unread book.
The letter, in this context, is what passes between subjects. What constitutes their very intersubjectivity? This relates dynamically to the debate in Node 7 concerning the letter's arrival. In Edgar Allan Poe's story, the letter passes from the Queen to the Minister, from the Minister to Dupin, and from Dupin to the police.
Each exchange does not merely transmit information. Rather, each transfer reconstitutes the symbolic positions of the subjects involved. This is the fundamental Lacanian insight. Subjects do not communicate directly, from ego to ego. They communicate through the letter, through the signifier that always already belongs to the other.
There is no direct touch, no transparent dialogue, only the letter sliding between us, shaping our faces as it passes. The letter is the medium of your unconscious, not a love note, not a warning, but the cold, physical architecture that makes it possible for you to speak at all.
The real dimension of the letter is undoubtedly the most difficult to grasp, precisely because the real is defined by Lacan as that which resists symbolization entirely. As we have established, in our primary definitions, and later sharpened in Node 5's distinction between the symbolic signifier and the real letter. The letter is the material element that resists absorption into the sliding metonymic play of signification. It is the indivisible kernel that persists beyond all meaning.
In the registry of the real, the letter appears as jouissance, as that excessive, traumatic enjoyment that the symbolic order both produces and forecloses. The real of the letter is also the domain of the object small a, the object cause of desire, that the symbolic order can never fully capture. The letter, in its circulation, traces the path of the object small a. It is the blank material object that the subject pursues without ever possessing. It represents the surplus that escapes every attempt at symbolic integration.
Feel the hunger of it. The letter is a blank space. You chase. A paper you can never read, but cannot stop hunting. This gives a radically new meaning to the postal circuit of Node 4. The letter's destination is not a simple coordinate. In a social network, it is the void at the very center of your structure.
Yes. The destination is the lac around which the entire symbolic order is structured. When Lacan writes that the letter always arrives at its destination, he is declaring that the letter's circuit inevitably returns to trace this central void. It lands on the gap where language fails.
In the end, the letter arrives because the emptiness of your desire was already there, waiting to receive it. It speaks. From your silence, it lands in the void of you.
In Lacan's later teaching, the concept of jouissance, enjoyment beyond the pleasure principle, becomes increasingly heavily central. Here, the letter is positioned as the precise, localized point where this enjoyment is both produced and foreclosed. This development flows directly from our primary definitions in Node 2, where we defined the letter as the material medium. That concrete discourse borrows from language. Every signifier, in its raw materiality, carries a surplus of enjoyment, a jouissance, that exceeds any possible symbolic meaning.
This played meaning, enjoyed meaning, links back to our crucial distinction in Node 5. While the symbolic signifier slides along the chain to produce meaning, the real letter acts as the horizontal bar, resisting signification. It is this very resistance that produces jouissance. By introducing the real into the symbolic order. This is why Lacan describes la langue, the maternal alluvium of language preceding the symbolic order, as a primary source of jouissance.
Listen to the babble. La langue is language. In its aspect as letter, pure materiality, the wet, rhythm-rich noises of a mother's tongue before it is broken into words. It has nothing to do with communication. It is the site of a raw, physical pleasure that simply strikes the body.
Indeed. The letter, in this late context, is the physical trace of an encounter between the organic body and language. It is the scar, or the mark, left by the subject's violent insertion into a pre-existing signifying chain. This insertion produces enjoyment as its unintended, structural byproduct.
We see here the tight terminal knot of our entire study. The letter is not a tool for the ego to use, but a cold, mechanical stamp that carves the biological flesh into a talking subject. It is an inscription that cannot be erased by translation or interpretation.
This is where the letter B arrives. It returns us to the central void of Node 9. The destination of every trajectory. Is this primary wound where language met your skin? You talk to cover the scar, but the letter is the only thing that remains true.
Lacan's engagement with the literary work of James Joyce, most notably in Seminar 23. The Synthome, dating from 1975 to 1976, opens a completely new dimension of the letter. Joyce's writing, with its extraordinary, dizzying proliferation of puns, portmanteau words, and complex multilingual resonances, exemplifies what Lacan calls jouissance, meaning enjoyment in meaning, or meaning pushed to its absolute threshold of physical enjoyment.
In Joyce's hands, the letter is no longer merely the passive material support of signification that determines our positions from the outside. Rather, it becomes the active site of a radical, experimental play with language's pure materiality. This concept flows directly from the somatic formulations of Node 10, where we defined la langue as language functioning purely as a non-semantic generator of raw physical jouissance. Joyce's glossolalia puts the signifying chain to new, unprecedented, and creative uses.
But think of how this responds to Node 9. In Node 9, we found a tragic truth: that the letter always arrives at its destination by falling directly into the traumatic void at your center, where the name of the Father fails. But what if you could build a bridge? What if the letter could shore up the hole?
This is what Joyce's writing demonstrates. The letter can be manipulated, twisted, and recombined in ways that produce entirely new subjective effects. It offers what Lacan calls suppletion, a supplementary construction that structurally holds together the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, precisely when the conventional paternal function has failed to do so.
This represents a significant expansion of the letter's role. Within psychoanalytic theory, it moves from being a structural element that determines the subject's passive position in the network of the other to a highly creative, custom-built resource that the subject can use to forge new, stable forms of subjective consistency.
Listen to the ink drying, stitching your mind together. The letter is no longer just the arrow pointing to your emptiness. It is the clay You mold to seal the rift. A private artifice. A custom knot. In the real
To keep your universe
from falling apart.
Jacques Lacan's concept of the letter is intimately, inextricably connected to his radical theory of writing. In his late teaching, he defines writing as a trace in which an effect of language can be read. This definition emphasizes that writing is not the mere representation of spoken speech, but the actual production of a material trace in which the effects of language, its slips, its equivocations, and its unintended consequences can be registered and read.
The letter, as the minimal unit of writing, is the vehicle of this trace. It is here that we find a profound response to our formulations in Node 5. In Node 5, we contrasted the symbolic signifier, which slides and floats along the chain of speech, with the real letter, which acts as the material barrier, or bar of resistance. The connection between the letter and writing illuminates Lacan's critique of the phonocentric tradition in linguistics. The tradition, exemplified by Saussure, that privileges speech over writing as the natural form of language.
Indeed, for Lacan, writing reveals something essential about language that speech desperately conceals: its raw materiality, its unyielding opacity, and its persistent resistance to meaning. The written letter, in its visual, spatial, and typographic form, makes highly palpable the material support that all language borrows from the signifier, a support that the apparent transparency of speech tends to obscure.
Writing, on this account, is not secondary to speech, but constitutive of it. The subject is always already written. We are always already inscribed in a symbolic order that precedes and exceeds any individual utterance. The proper name that Lacan invokes in The Instance of the Letter is the paradigmatic case. It is the exact point at which the subject is written into language, marked by a hard signifier that the subject did not choose and cannot change.
Your name. It is the trace
of the other's writing.
upon your body. The mark of a language. That spoke you before your lips could ever part. Recall Note 11 of how James Joyce manipulated these written marks to twist them into a supplement for his failing structure. If you are written by the other, then you must learn how to rewrite the fact.
Yes. If Joyce's suppletion was possible, it is because writing is an active, material intervention, not a passive translation of the voice. The letter in the proper name is the trace of the other's pen, a permanent cut in the real.
Can you feel the weight of that ink? Before you speak, you are already cataloged. You do not speak words. The letters are speaking you. The trace is set. What has been written in you? Your scar.
In Jacques Lacan's late clinical teaching, the defining goal of psychoanalysis is no longer the radical traversal of fantasy, as was proposed in the 1960s, but the final identification with the synthome. The synthome is, in a sense, the subject's highly singular and idiosyncratic solution to the absolute impossibility of the sexual relationship. It is the particular, custom-built way each subject manages to live, with the symbolic order's structural inconsistency holding together the three registers of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real.
The synthome is closely and fundamentally integrated, linked to the letter. It is the subject's characteristic, ingrained mode, of using the letter, of organizing and arranging the signifying chain, and of producing a particular stable pattern of jouissance. That is entirely unique to that subject. This responds directly to the circulation of the other's letters that we examined in Node 8. While in Node 8, the subject was a helpless node, buffeted by the mechanical sliding of letters. In the other's discourse, the syntome represents the subject's active, creative manipulation of those very same letters to build a customized relational anchor.
You do not have to be a victim to the letters that carved you. This is the ultimate promise of Node 11. Just as James Joyce used the raw, multilingual letters of his writing
To craft a supplementary knot.
when his paternal function failed, you too can learn to use the letter as the very clay of your existence. The letters are both the prison and the key to the door.
The letter, in this late clinical context, is paradoxically both the problem and the solution. It is the material element that produces the subject's suffering. The repetitive, automatic, and clinical return of the exact same signifiers that structure and fuel the debilitating symptom. But it is also the singular resource through which the subject can forge a completely new relation to their own traumatic jouissance.
It acts as a suppletion, a supplementary construction that allows the subject to live day by day with the real's radical impossibility. Therefore, the analyst's intervention at the deep level of the letter aims not to eliminate the symptom, nor to make the subject normal in an imaginary sense, but to shift the subject's relation to its structure. The goal is to transform a painful, debilitating repetition into a livable, even highly creative, aesthetic pattern.
Stop trying to cure. What makes you singular? The analyst's hand does not erase the writing. It helps you hold the pen to take the letters of your pain and rewrite them into a beautiful, bizarre, and livable knot. Let the letters fall exactly where they must,
And let that
be your home.
Jacques Lacan's choice of Edgar Allan Poe's The Purloined Letter as the primary vehicle for his entire theory of the letter is far from accidental. Poe's story, in its exact geometric structure, beautifully enacts the operations of the signifying chain that Lacan wishes to illuminate. The letter in Poe's tale is the perfect material allegory of the Lacanian letter, an allegory that flows directly from our primary definitions in Node 2. It is a material object whose immense power lies entirely in its geographic structural position, whose written content is completely irrelevant, and whose circulation determines the fates of all who come into contact with it.
The letter in Poe's story is, as Lacan repeatedly emphasizes, hidden in plain sight. It is placed in a trumpery, cheap filigree card rack of pasteboard, hanging from the mantelpiece. It sits where anyone could see it, yet no one does. This peculiar hiding in plain sight is precisely the way the letter operates in our unconscious. It is always there, always completely visible on the surface, yet perpetually overlooked by a defensive consciousness that searches only for hidden imaginary depths. The analyst is the one who learns to see what is right before his eyes. He learns to read the letter in its raw literality, rather than seeking it in the symbolic shadows of interpretation.
Stop looking down into the imaginary well. The secret is not hidden in the deep. It is pasted on the wall. In Node 13, you saw how the subject's symptom is made of these repeating material letters. The way out of your suffering is not to find a hidden meaning, but to learn to read the obvious, flat surface
of your script,
read the cardboard rack
of your life.
This literary dimension of the letter also raises important questions about the nature of clinical interpretation. Traditional literary criticism, much like primitive imaginary psychoanalysis, approaches a text as a vehicle for meaning. It seeks to decode its symbols and uncover its deep, hidden themes. Lacan's theory of the letter suggests a radically different approach. To read a text to the letter is to attend entirely to its materiality, to the operations of the signifying chain that produce meaning as an effect, rather than expressing it as a pre-existing content.
This is why Lacan describes his own method, not as a revision, but as a literal return to Freud. Not a return to Freud's imaginary ideas or hidden meaning, but a return to the very letter of Freud's written text. It is a return to the precise, written, signifying chain that produces the unconscious in Freud's writing.
Listen to the rustle of the page. The littoral edge, where the water of meaning meets the dry sand. Of the letter. The letter does not hold a secret. The letter is the secret, resting there, in the light. Stop translating what you say, and look at the physical shape of your breath.
The clinical operation
On the letter must be understood within the broader polemical context of Lacan's self-proclaimed return to Freud, a return that was simultaneously a radical structural reinterpretation. Lacan argued that post-Freudian psychoanalysis, particularly the Anglo-American ego psychology that dominated the 1950s, had fundamentally betrayed Freud's most radical insights. By reducing psychoanalysis to a comfortable theory of adaptation and transparent communication, this current clinical dimension responds directly to Node 10's formulations of structure and repetition. We do not heal the subject by helping them communicate better, because the unconscious is not a communicative tool.
Against the trend of adaptation, Lacan insisted on the structural opacity of the signifier and the fundamental impossibility of full representation. He anchored psychoanalysis in the failure of language to coincide with being. The letter, in this clinical context, is Lacan's sharpest weapon against the psychologizing tendencies of his contemporaries. By emphasizing the letter, the material, indivisible, meaningless element of language, Lacan refuses any reduction of the unconscious to a soft repository of repressed memories, hidden wishes, or adaptive ego strategies.
It is a machine. The unconscious is not a warm inner soul, but an objective mechanism that processes letters according to formal, structural rules. This radical, cold materialism is what separates Lacan from all other clinical schools. In Node 10, you saw how this machine repeats, stamping out the same pattern of suffering. The analyst's job is not to have a heart-to-heart conversation, but to throw a wrench into the gears of the machine.
Lacan's concept of the letter also positions him within the broader mid-20th century intellectual movements. His structural engagements with linguistics, with Levi Strauss's structural anthropology, with Heidegger's phenomenology, and with cybernetics, information theory, and game theory, all leave their deep, indelible marks on his formulations. Yet Lacan's profound originality lies in his stubborn refusal to reduce psychoanalysis to any of these fields.
The letter is not merely a linguistic concept. It is not merely an anthropological tool, nor is it a philosophical metaphor. It is the specifically psychoanalytic name for the raw materiality of language, as it operates in the unconscious. It is the precise point where all these other academic discourses converge, and where they all fail. This brings us back to Node 14 and the littoral edge. Since the letter sits on the edge of the void, where meaning breaks down, the clinic must operate strictly on this edge.
Do you hear the edge? The analyst does not translate your stories. They cut them. They punctuate the chain. They read you to the letter, not to find out what you mean, but to expose the cold, hollow letters that have been running your life. The cure is not in the meaning. It is in the cutting of the script.
The dense concept of the letter
Remains vitally, urgently relevant
for contemporary clinical psychoanalysis, philosophy, and cultural theory. In the modern clinic, the letter continues to guide Lacanian practice. This contemporary clinical application flows directly from Node 15, which defined analysis not as adaptive communication, but as an operation on the material machine of the unconscious. The analyst does not listen for warm, psychologized meanings. Rather, they listen specifically for the letter's stubborn insistence, listening not for communication, but for the signifying chain's repetitive, automatic operation.
The letter is what allows the analyst to intervene at the precise, traumatic point where the unconscious speaks. It is how we catch the subject in the act of saying more than it consciously means, and of meaning more than it ever says. In philosophy, this power has been taken up by major contemporary thinkers, such as Slavoj Žižek, Alain Badiou, and Jacques-Alain Miller. They use the letter F as a sharp structural tool for rethinking the complex architectures of ideology, of truth, and of the modern subject.
Slavoj Žižek's extensive commentaries on Poe's formula, a letter always arrives at its destination, have made the letter a central, indispensable concept in contemporary discussions of political subjectivity and ideological interpolation. For Žižek, the letter names the fundamental, mechanical mechanism by which a political ideology hails the subject, constituting it as a political agent through the imaginary recognition of a symbolic call.
In literary and cultural theory, the letter offers a powerful, rigorous alternative to both classic hermeneutic and standard deconstructive models of reading. To read a text strictly to the letter is neither to decode hidden meanings, which is the naive hermeneutic approach, nor is it to celebrate the infinite, free play of empty signification, which is the deconstructive approach. Rather, it is to attend closely to the raw, material insistence of the signifier. It means attending to the structural necessity that governs the text's production of both meaning and enjoyment.
Read the surface limit. The text is a machine, producing effects completely independent of any author's intention. This returns us to Node 2. Remember the primary definition of the letter as an essentially localized, meaningless structural position inside a vast differential system. Today, you carry this system in your hand.
In our current age of digital communication, the concept of the letter acquires astonishing and terrifying new resonances. The email, the text message, and the algorithmic feed all operate according to the exact formal principles that Lacan's theory of the letter illuminates. The digital letter in code is precisely a signifier without a signified. It is a material coordinate that circulates in a global network, determining the social and economic positions of subjects, without reference to any original human meaning.
The modern algorithm,
In its automated, cold processing of data, is the contemporary high-speed version of the machine that thinks like men that Lacan dryly invoked in his cybernetic analogies of the 50s. The letter, in short, is not merely an antique psychoanalytic concept from a bygone era. It remains the fundamental key to understanding the linguistic, digital, and symbolic structures that govern contemporary human life.
Look at your screen. The blue light is the writing of the other. You are hummed to sleep. By a machine that thinks you. The letters circulate, positioning your desire, counting your beats, establishing your void. The digital envelope has already landed where you sit. You are the address. The letter is home.
Drawing together the intricate threads of this entire investigation, we can now articulate a fully coherent, comprehensive account of the letter within Jacques Lacan's theoretical architecture. This grand synthesis allows us to formulate the definitive laws of the letter, shedding light on how these laws govern both neuroses and the psychotic return of foreclosed marks. First and foremost, the letter is the material support of the signifier. It is not the physical stuff of ink or sound, but the raw structural materiality that makes signification possible. This relates back to Node 16's primordial mark, the unary trait, acting as the essentially localized structure of the signifier, the minimal unit of structural position and difference. That gives the entire signifying chain its mechanical consistency.
Second, the letter is indivisible. It is defined not by its material composition, but entirely by its structural coordinate within a system. Therefore, it maintains its absolute identity, even under partition. This unique indivisibility places the letter firmly in the register of the real, distinguishing it cleanly from the signifier, which belongs to the symbolic, and from meaning, which belongs only to the imaginary. The letter is the real of language. The exact hard point where the symbolic order touches its own unyielding limit.
Third, the letter insists. It returns and repeats, producing the relentless automatism of repetition that structures the unconscious itself. We saw this clearly in Node 10's discussion of structure and repetition. The letter is not an innocent vehicle for human communication, but the cold, automated agent of a structural destiny. It is a machine that determines the absolute positions of subjects, constitutes their desires, and produces the somatic effects of jouissance that mark their relation to the other.
Fourth, the letter kills meaning. It cuts directly into the transparent flow of signification. It introduces the opacity and materiality of the real into the sliding differential play of the symbolic. To the letter is to attend to this raw materiality. It is to listen for the clinical unconscious in the very physical stuff of language, rather than in its apparent imaginary content. Fifth, the letter is the cause of desire. It is what produces the fundamental structural lack that launches the subject into the endless, metonymic search of desire. The letter's circulation traces the literal path of the objet small a, the object cause of desire, that the symbolic order can never fully capture.
Sixth, the letter produces jouissance. In its raw materiality, it carries a screaming surplus of enjoyment that exceeds all meaning. It is the physical scar left by the primary collision between your body and language, the mark of a traumatic enjoyment that language both produces and desperately tries to exclude. This is why, when symbolic foreclosure occurs, the letter returns in the real, projecting itself outdoors in the physical hallucinations of the psychotic.
Seventh, and finally, a letter always arrives at its destination. This does not occur because of some mystical or teleological guarantee. It occurs because the letter's destination is nothing other than the structural position it inevitably occupies, the clinical effects it inevitably produces, and the subjects it inevitably constitutes. The destination is not preordained, but retroactively constituted by the letter's arrival. It is not a geographical place, but a structural necessity.
The letter is the name Lacan gives to the fundamental, impossible antagonism of language. It is what makes you a subject and what tears you in half. It is the medium of your desire and the wall that blocks it, the symbolic order that gives you a home, and the real, destabilizing kernel that makes every home unstable. But don't look away. The letter is also your only resource, the unique synthematic artifice that allows you to stitch your registers together and forge a path through the impossible.
The concept of the letter carries an implicit, profound ethical dimension that Lacan makes entirely explicit in his later clinical teaching. If the letter is indeed the material support of the signifier, and if the signifier is what fundamentally constitutes us as subjects, then our relation to the letter is ultimately our relation to our own unconscious. It is our relation to the part of ourselves that we do not control, that speaks through us, and that determines both our positions and our desires. This connects us back directly to Node 12's theory of writing and the absolute inscription of the proper name long before we speak. The letter of the other has already written us.
Therefore, the ethics of psychoanalysis, on this radical account, is not an ethics of self-mastery, nor is it an ethics of adaptive communication. It is, quite simply, an ethics of direct confrontation with the letter. It is the structural willingness to recognize ourselves entirely as the effects of a signifying chain that precedes and exceeds us, and to fully assume the consequences of this recognition. This is what Lacan famously means by not giving ground relative to one's desire, ne pas céder sur son désir. This ethics requires the subject to maintain its absolute fidelity to the letter, to the raw signifying chain that structures its desire, even when this fidelity leads to suffering, impasse, or isolation.
What remains when all your imaginary stories have collapsed and your symbolic family supports have fallen away?
The letter is what remains.
It is the indivisible, insistent kernel of the real that you must learn to live with, rather than constantly trying to evade. In Node 15, we formulated the clinical operation as a refusal to reduce your symptom to imaginary, psychologized depths. The analyst does not hand you a new meaning. They push you to confront the flat surface of your script.
In the final analysis, Jacques Lacan's concept of the letter offers a radical, challenging theory of human subjectivity. It is a theory in which the human being is not the master of language, but its fragile effect, not the proud author of meaning, but its mechanical product, not a self-transparent Cartesian consciousness, but a divided, barred subject, constituted by the opaque materiality of the signifying chain. The letter is the psychoanalytic name for this structural opacity, this split, and this fundamental alienation of the speaking being.
And it is also, in its very materiality, the trace of something that exceeds all subjectivity. It is the real that language both produces and forecloses, the impossible that structures every possibility of meaning. It is for this reason that we must link back to Node 17's great synthesis of laws. If a letter always arrives at its destination, it is because its destination is nothing other than the structural position it retroactively constitutes. The letter challenges us to read differently, To read not for comforting semantic depth, but for formal structure. Not for content, but for typographic surface.
Accept the challenge. To read Lacan to the letter. Renounce the soft comfort of imaginary depth. Attend to the material. Unyielding insistence of the signifier. Accept that your unconscious is not a golden treasure to be dug up, but a mechanical track to be traversed. A letter to be followed to its inevitable destination. Confront the real of your language. The point where meaning fails, where the letter is delivered, where you are forced to see what you truly are. Not the author of your life, but the effect of a writing that started without you. A letter in the unconscious, a scratch on the impossible,